grad school has broken me. And as a broken man, only now do I realize how much college is such a scam. If you're already balls deep into this abhorrent system, I truly wish the best of luck to you. I can only impart some wisdom that I never got the chance to hear myself after the fact. So here is my wisdom. This video is either for people in any scientific field that uses the chi-square fit test or students who are trapped in said field. If you aren't in either of those camps, this video ain't for you. And a fair warning, this assumes that you already know about said chi-square fit tests, and there's plenty of videos and resources out there to help you on that if you don't. So let's begin. We all know what chi-square tests are, assuming you are still here for the video. And we all know that they can be very useful about discovering things about your data, like if your uncertainty is not good enough, or even if it's too good. There are many, many things you can use this for, but we're not going to get into the details now. I want this to be a fairly concise video just to get the point across. There are two key tricks that were not necessarily gone over in much detail in my curriculum. One was briefly mentioned, but I feel like a lot of students don't know about this, and the other was not mentioned at all. So let's go through this. What I chose here is the total number of state trifectas in the United States over time. A fairly random thing. I thought it might be interesting to look at. As it turns out, since around 2002, we can actually model this value as a linear fit. And of course, most people obviously would know that as of 2023, we live in quite the polarized society, but it's very difficult to quantize that. But fortunately, now we have a way to do that, because this can actually be a very useful way to quantize that value. Of course, we all know political science isn't real science, but we can still do some scientific analysis of these numbers. So let's begin. I'm going to skip most of this because it's not too important. Bear in mind that I chose the uncertainty values to be constant, but remember that they do not have to be. Especially because this is a chi-square test, that can actually be very useful because different values can be weighted differently depending on your uncertainties. But here I just made it simple and just made them all the same, and then treated them all as one value essentially. So here, to give some context, is the first graph that we get if we plot the previous 20 years, very nice round number, of the total number of state trifectas over time. And you can probably make a linear fit out of this, I thought. So let's see how true that is. If we take our chi-square values and guess that the values are going to be around 10 and 1. It seems like those aren't too far off because here it's very close to 1, and here it's about 9.5 for the slope. So clearly these parameters are fit well enough that at this point most people would simply say this is good enough. In fact, we can also compare our values of the would-be model to our actual data, and it's actually pretty close. Obviously, there's going to be some outliers, but that can be attributed to pretty much random noise in this example. However, there is a trick that a lot of professors may skip over, and that trick is the fact that you can actually find the uncertainty of each parameter individually if you simply take the chi-square value of the minimum chi-square value of each parameter, add 1, and see what the resulting parameter value for that chi-square value is. That difference is actually defined as the uncertainty of that parameter. And recall that you can also use error propagation as an independent method of verifying this. If all of your uncertainty values are different, that can complicate things. But if they are the same, then this actually is a fairly quick way of verifying if this value is actually close to the mark or not. And in the link, there's a link in the description I will include that actually goes through this error propagation in case you need a refresher on that, or in case you haven't even seen it before. But essentially, the bottom line is that, and unfortunately they don't have a good, here, this equation right here is the most important thing because this works for any model. do note that this is an operator, and that is just delta, as in the uncertainty. When some professors write this on the board, sometimes they write it as very, very similar looking characters. They are not the same. Bear that in mind. Here I will also include this as a refresher of chi-squares in case anyone needs it. But again, links will be in the description. But for now, let's get back to our example. So again, it's at this point, pretty much everybody would say, okay, well, that's good enough. But we are missing one major point. And the point that we missed is the fact that we had to use random guesses as part of our chi-square equations. Because here you'll notice that this value for m and this value for b actually change these chi-square values depending on what we use. So if we can change these values to what we got on those graphs, we might get closer, but then we'll be still off by a smaller amount, and then we just have to keep going back and forth until eventually we get to something that we're satisfied with. But that is not very scientific in any way, shape, or form. So instead, let's use a trick. And the trick is called automation. In this case, let's represent the total number of chi-squares in both cases for b and m to be this large matrix where we take both ranges of m and b and put them on a single matrix. Recall the formula, or recall the figures from before. That eventually results, if you plot this in 3 dimensions, you'll get this. Now, I wish there was a better way to show this in Matlab, but if we orient this so it is about here, you'll notice, interesting. It's almost like that's the cross-section of the previous figure we were looking at, and indeed that is the case. Unfortunately, the cross-section doesn't work well in this case because the scaling is a bit off because each parameter is weighed a bit differently. But clearly we can see that this crevice here, this trough if you will, is actually the minimum chi-square value is certainly on this somewhere, but we don't know where. We need the point of where b and m match so that they result in the lowest chi-square value possible. And in doing so, we can find that that value is actually about 132, which is associated with this reduced chi-square value, because remember, the reduced chi-square is this value divided by the degrees of freedom, which in this case is, I believe, 18. And that value is about 6.6, which is okay. It could be better. Anything above 1 and under 10 is usually good enough for student work, in my opinion. But in actual scientific literature, I feel like that would not necessarily be accepted. But again, this is just a random example we're using. And these values here, this is your bread and butter. These are, based on the step sizes we chose, the closest values to the slope and the y-intercept that we can possibly achieve using this chi-square analysis method. Bear in mind that these values are dependent on said step size, and you can increase the total, or rather decrease the total number of, decrease the total step size in between each step, which then would increase the total number of iterations this would have to go through. However, in doing so, that would exponentially increase the time this would take to compute. So just bear in mind, there is a trade-off. In theory, this should work as well in dimensions greater than 2. In other words, this should work for parameters that are greater in number than 2, depending on the model you're working with. Also, this can be done in Python. I chose not to because, number 1, I'm lazy. Number 2, I was taught most of this stuff on Matlab anyway. And number 3, it's a lot easier to go through visually and just see what we are doing, because sometimes Python and other languages can be a little it's very difficult to tell what's happening sometimes, so this is just easier to explain. So this trick could be used, again, for any number of parameters. Just bear in mind that you won't be able to make, there are ways to make 3D matrices, but that gets very complicated very quickly. Essentially, the bottom line is you have to be very careful about those values you guess with, because every time you change that, you end up changing the total reduced chi-square value along with it, along with the parameters themselves that you find at the end with their uncertainties. But as for me and my studies, I hope to never see any of this shit ever again. So see you later, suckers. That's the trick, and that's the end of the video. Goodbye.